grand home she would build upon her return to Pennsylvania, Linden Hall. When we return, we tour the 35-room castle of the woman who was thrust into the coal business by cruel fate and went on to become one of the industry's first and most successful businesswomen. We now return to America's Castles on A&E. On an estate of 780 acres near Dawson, Pennsylvania, where Sarah Cochran and her late husband had previously spent their summers, Mrs. Cochran built a regal English Tudor mansion inspired by St. James Palace in London. The drive that encircled the estate's terraced lawns and led to the home's magnificent entrance was originally lined with linden trees and became the inspiration for the estate's name, Linden Hall. Pittsburgh architect John Wilkins, whose grand public buildings were well known throughout Pennsylvania, was commissioned to design Linden Hall. Construction began in 1911 and lasted nearly 2 years. 60 stonemasons were hired and brought from Italy specifically to craft the locally quarried limestone of which the home was built. The finished basement and 3 stories above ground combined for 35 rooms and over 35,000 square feet of living space. Sarah Cochran hosted a formal dedication of the home on Christmas Day, 1913, and moved in the following month. The total cost of the estate was over $2 million. Guests arrived at Linden Hall at the home's rear, entering through a doorway flanked by classical Corinthian limestone columns. Once inside, visitors were greeted in a marble hallway, lit from above by an ornate alabaster fixture. Carved into the alabaster were the Latin words for the endeavors which occupied most of Sarah Cochran's philanthropic energy and attention: art, labor, and science. Once inside the home, all eyes were inevitably drawn to the room just beyond a doorway framed by contrasting shades of Italian marble, Linden Hall's Great Hall. The Great Hall, with its oak parquet floor of more than 1,800 square feet, was inspired by the banquet halls in the many castles Mrs. Cochran had visited in Europe. The ceiling, of molded plaster, was hand-stenciled with a fleur-de-lis pattern, to which Mrs. Cochran's initial was added in gold leaf. The spacious Great Hall allowed Mrs. Cochran to host as many as 125 guests and still have room for an orchestra. If an orchestra was inappropriate, she would hire a professional organist to play her hand-carved Aeolian player organ. Mrs. Cochran paid $50,000 for it in 1912, a time when the average home cost $5,000. At the center of the Great Hall was a teak table, hand-carved in Italy and topped with black Italian marble. In the tradition of many of her European hosts, Sarah Cochran would receive guests at the table. Often, Sarah's parties were in honor of associates in the coal industry or members of her family in charge of her businesses. From her station at the table, Sarah ensured that the guests of honor were appropriate